accept the proposition that there's been no strategic overview. The next point that was raised by Mr. Coursier was, I think, a hint or a suggestion that there hasn't been any new field work or field visits. That's not right. As I've explained, field visits have taken place, and they've taken place in conjunction with the preparation of the new addendum. The next point raised by Mr. Courier is a concern about how sites have been fed into the assessment work and the differential treatment of allocated sites in the new addendum when compared with the previous one. It's right, first of all, to record that freestanding sites are dealt with specifically within Annex 5. Other sites, though, as we will see when one's looking at the detailed boundary section, are covered as part of the annexes when one is looking at the boundary setting exercise. So where allocations are being proposed, they are taken into account as part of the boundary setting exercise, which looks at the contribution of the land along that part of the boundary to greenbelt purposes and asks whether the boundary setting is consistent with the spatial strategy in the local plan. So we don't accept any criticism relating to the change in approach. We say that taking in site allocations as part of the broader boundary setting exercise is entirely legitimate. The next point that was raised by Mr. Coursier related to the assessment of sites and the evidence base. And I think there was a specific allegation that the housings of topic paper deal with heritage but not green belt. I think with respect that sort of misunderstands what the Council has been trying to explain, that the heritage topic paper identified characteristics in York that are directly relevant to Purpose 4. In particular, the need to protect the character and setting of York. So there is a clear read across between the work that was being conducted in the heritage topic paper and the methodology for the green belt boundaries, which has been explained. There was a specific point made about views, and in response to that, for your notes, sir, page 74 of the addendum, under Criterion 2, Landmark Monuments, part of the historic context evidence is the CHCCA views analysis, which is then cross-referenced in Annex 1, Evidence 13. And if one looks, actually Annex 1, yes, Annex 1, the evidence base, points 13A and 13B include within the suite of the explanation of how the heritage topic paper has been used, they include reference to the Central Historic Core Views Analysis, long distance views at 13A, and 13B, Central Historic Core Views Analysis, city-wide views. So we simply don't accept that views haven't been taken into account as part of the evidence base that's been relied upon by the Council.
Can I just ask, Mr. Lynas, are those documents that you've just referred to documents that have been used to answer the questions posed at 2.1 and 2.2?
Yes. Yes, sir. The way it works is that on page 74, there are the detailed assessment questions set out in the left-hand column. Assessment evidence is in the right-hand column, and that will include the views analysis that's identified there. So yes, that evidence has been taken into account. And if you look at Annex 1, with particular reference to the topic paper. It explains why it's been taken into account.
Yeah, no, just to help you out, I understand how those boxes are intended to work.
Thank you,
I knew the answer to the question.
Okay, thank you, sir. Next, sir, as far as Mr. Coursier is concerned, there's a general allegation about there being a major inconsistency in the boundary results flowing from the assessment work. And Mr. Coursier, again, draws out what he says are examples from the HAA and the sustainability appraisal. We don't accept that. There are serious inconsistencies, as he's alleged, but again, that's really a matter to be resolved. This is more about the application of the methodology, we say, which needs to be examined in the context of individual boundary elements, which will be considered at a later stage, not the methodology itself. Then finally, dealing with Mr. Johnson's comments, insofar as he made reference to the same aspect of the addendum relating to compensation as you highlighted, sir, I think we've taken the point on that. The heading that's been identified in the paper relating to compensation probably isn't an entirely accurate reflection of what those paragraphs are seeking to do based on current policy as opposed to based on NPPF 2012 as opposed to current policy. Essentially, the reference in the paragraphs that we discussed before is about looking to see how any harm can be minimised and adopting broader principles relating to sustainability and placemaking. As far as Mr. Johnson makes the point that, well, the Council's approached this in terms of releasing land from the Green Belt, we're very well aware, sir, of not just the aspects of the letter that we've discussed already, as you set out in June 2020, relating to the particular methodology, but also your finding that we don't have to demonstrate exceptional circumstances because we're in the context of a boundary setting exercise. So the Council hasn't approached this as if we need to demonstrate exceptional circumstances. We have applied a methodology which, for the reasons we've explained, looks first of all at Greenbelt purposes and then looks at consistency with the local plan strategy. And it's unfair to characterise it as if we were applying the exceptional circumstances approach. Certain points were raised by Mr. Johnson, and again, with respect, I think we're treading into boundary setting questions, which no doubt he will return to at a later stage. We know the issue between Mr. Johnson and the Council relating to the boundary for his sites, in particular the decision to separate the allocation from the main built-up area, or in his position, join it. That's really a matter of judgment to be decided at a later stage, having regard to the historic England position that we set out before about the benefits of the clock face approach that has been taken by the Council. I don't need to say anything more about that, but as Mr. Johnson anticipates, I'm sure it will be debated at a later stage. Just check Mr. Wood had anything more to add.
Not a lot more, thank you, but just I guess 2 points, just to the specific points that were raised. Firstly, Mr. Wright sort of surmised about the role of the 2003 Greenbelt appraisal. I just really want to point to paragraphs 5.12 to 5.16 of the addendum, which sets out how the Council has used the Greenbelt appraisal work and its role in this exercise. So just that helps to clarify on that point. And just a specific point from Mr. Good on landmark monuments and the heritage topic paper. Yes, the heritage topic paper does set out some examples of key landmark monuments in the city, but as with all the principal characteristics, it also sort of really invites and wants an assessment and identification of that done in a locality, as well as looking at those examples that are given, and that's what the methodology reflects. Thank you.
I think it was Mr. Corsia that mentioned the question of harm, the greenbelt harm, Mr. Linus. I'm not sure that you addressed that in your reply.
Yes, I think the point that was being made by Mr. Corsia was that there was somehow a difference of approach taken now as opposed to the earlier work which had sought to identify the harm resulting from individual strategic allocations. I think the answer to that is that the way that it's been done in the new addendum is that the freestanding settlements will be dealt with in Annex 5 and judgments reached in that context because they're a particular feature which can be separated from other aspects of the wider boundary setting exercise. As far as the other sites are concerned, they've been treated as part of the wider boundary setting, so the implications of setting a boundary with those allocations in them is covered separately in other annexes, and the judgments reached still look at the contribution that land makes to greenbelt purposes. So judgments on harm to the greenbelt or the impact on greenbelt purposes are implicit in the judgments that are reached in the boundary setting exercise in those annexes.
And you've looked at them like that, have you? Well, is this relevant to the point that Mr. Tucker made that in setting the boundaries, you first have to consider meeting needs?
Yes, the way it was done, sir, as you'll see in the later annexes, the assessment is split into two. One looks at the greenbelt purposes and the contribution that land makes in setting the boundaries. Then there is a question about consistency with the local plan strategy. So insofar as the local plan strategy is about meeting identified needs, it's taken into account when setting the boundary, one asks the question, is this consistent with what the local plan is seeking to do? And therefore it's been taken into account as part of that aspect of the assessment.
I understand, thank you. Mr. Natkus.
Thank you, sir. I've just got a few points to make on some of what we've heard so far, and then also on the methodology as well, and I won't stray into sites, you'll be glad to know. I think the views of what we have to do now is the local authority looking at setting the inner boundary, the outer boundary, the village insets, and also some development sites. And previously we know that the approach they took was to identify the greenbelt and then seek to change it. And your letter confirmed that as unsound, but equally your letter identified paragraphs 83 and 84 of the framework and the need to confirm settlement policies and promoting sustainable patterns of development. So therefore the broad approach to identifying those allocations and those new settlements is sound. However, I appreciate we'll have to come on to the boundaries of it. The methodology that's changed really seems to focus on those boundaries rather than the methodology as a whole, and that's what I want to touch on really. And I think everyone knows my main issue with the Council's approach has always been that the starting point was wrong, that they sought to set the greenbelt boundary and then release land from it. And we know that that was wrong, and they're now looking to change it. Because we're setting the boundaries for the first time, the framework's absolutely clear that we shouldn't keep land open that isn't necessary to be kept open. And I think what we have to keep remembering in this process is that we're setting the greenbelt boundary. We're not setting housing allocations or employment allocations and everything else as greenbelt. We have to look at every piece of land and what it should be done. And some of that's dead simple to establish, some of it's more difficult. But in my view, and in all our representations, we've always identified that at the end of this plan, there should be greenbelt land, there should be allocated land, and there should be some non-greenbelt, non-allocated land, because it just seems incomprehensible that that would be the case in this geographical area, that there isn't any land that doesn't fall into either being needed for an allocation or meeting the purposes of the greenbelt.
Do you have a name or names for such land?
You'd probably just call it white land historically, wouldn't you? That it would just be white land that is there. Unfortunately, the Council's approach seems to be greenbelt or allocate. Now, we know that previous allocations that are no longer needed are now in the Greenbelt, which I have an issue with. We know that there are gaps between the allocations, as Mr Johnson's mentioned, which I equally have an issue with. And we know that the inner boundaries are so tightly drawn that it does just follow the existing pattern, which I think Mr Tucker was talking about earlier with regards buildings on the university. And my concern is that the council are continuing to perpetuate that earlier error in looking at this. And I think the comments about retrofitting probably come from my representations, because I've mentioned this a few times. And even this morning we heard from Mr Wood, he referenced releasing land from the Greenbelt. I think we have to be clear, we're not releasing any land from the Greenbelt. But the fact that comments like that are still being made implies this undercurrent of that's where the council's thinking is. And again, the idea of the compensatory land, which I appreciate they're now saying is probably an incorrect wording, for me just feels as if we are looking at this in the wrong way. And anecdotally, are we to believe that over the last 50 years that the development of York has grown in such a way through applications and development that the boundary that exists now just happens to perfectly align with the 5 purposes of the Greenbelt? I mean, it can't be possible. And secondly, the new approach that's been taken, whilst I don't think it's that radically different, and I think actually what the council have sought to do is just to provide more data and evidence on how they got there. But again, is a new approach with different questions likely to come up with the same answers when they were applying exceptional circumstances previously? And again, I don't think that's a position that could be upheld. So I think that's the underlying current that does concern me. And when we come on to the site specifics, we will talk about the boundaries to identify where those concerns are. But just to touch on the methodology, there's a few points that I want to make. In terms of purpose 4, which is to do with the historic, the protecting of the historic city, I think the first point has to be the definition of the historic city. Because to me, we're in the historic city. The walls are there, we can quite clearly see where that is. There's large parts of this city which aren't historic. There are large parts which are very modern developments, modern growth, and I think we have to be really careful when we talk about compactness of the city that we're looking at the historic city, and we're not just looking at not allowing any development on open areas because that would prejudice the compactness which seems to come forward. In terms of landmark buildings, and this has been touched upon previously, but the heritage topic paper is clear in pages 44 to 46 of what a landmark monument is. And it won't surprise you that it's things like the Minster, Clifford's Tower, buildings that we would all look at and think that is a landmark monument. It defines them as things that you would use as place finding. However, paragraph 8.27 of the topic paper now expands this. And Mr. Good touched on it earlier. It talks about almost waypoints and individual listed buildings, and that's exactly what the council were told not to do. Now, again, this morning, Mr. Wood talked about how openness could be important for an individual heritage asset that then impacts the openness of the city. And I think, again, I can't see how an individual listed building and it need for it to be kept openness can then mean that land should be in the Greenbelt. And actually, the letter that was sent to the council way back in June dealt with this, because it actually said, on the whole, it seems unlikely that the presence of such features would have a significant influence when talking about individual listed buildings or scheduled monuments. And I think Mr. Linus said that that hasn't been done, but question 2.1 says, does land need to be kept permanently open to understand the original siting or context of a building, landmark or monument? So again, it is looking at individual buildings. I'm not sure if any of the actual assessments do touch on a building, because a certain site that I won't mention, which previously did touch on a building, has now a slightly different one. But again,
forgive me. Is your point that it shouldn't be about individual buildings or structures, monuments, whatever, but rather that it should be about specified buildings or structures or monuments?
Well, it should be the landmark monuments, and the landmark monuments are identified in the heritage topic paper as things such as the Minster and Clifford's Tower. They're not individual listed buildings, and I think that paragraph 8.27 shows that it's now tried to bring those individual buildings back into this. The assessment in terms of protecting the historic city also now expands out to landscape setting. And again, I can understand this in principle, because previously figure 3 showed us the areas such as the wedges and the green strays and things like that. So I can understand why those areas may want to be in the Greenbelt. However, what we're now seeing in some of the assessments is sites that affect the setting of one of those is deemed to be important to the setting of the city. So we're effectively saying if you affect the setting of the city, then it should be in the green belt. And that can't be the case. And finally, on question 3.2, it references individual parks or historic gardens, which again are exactly the same as listed buildings or scheduled monuments. It shouldn't be put in the green belt. Rowntree's Park is a park. It's not going to get built on. It doesn't need to be in the green belt. It can just stay as a park that stays as effectively white land with a designation over it under development management policies. And the last point I just want to make is on urban sprawl, which is I forget exactly which greenbelt purpose it is, or purpose one, there we go, to prevent the unrestricted sprawl of large built-up areas. Now, question 4.1 on this says, is land connected to or within proximity to the urban area? Now, when we're setting the inner boundary, the answer to that is yes on every single question. So it's almost just a pointless question because it can't not do, otherwise it wouldn't be the inner boundary. So 4.1 is almost a given, and I don't really have an issue with it being in, but I just think you give any weight to the answer being yes. So the next two questions give very specific responses in terms of the presence of buildings or whether or not it's open on more than one side. Absolutely fine, and I agree with that. However, when you look at individual assessments, and we will come on to it at another time, a new test is introduced to say, actually it's quite a big site, therefore it could have an impact on sprawl. Now that isn't in there, so I think we have to be really careful that when we do get onto the site assessments, we simply look at those questions. We don't start introducing new ones to say, yes, you are really well contained, but because you're so big, we think it should be in the green belt. So I think we will look. I mean, my broad point is there are some issues with it. I don't think it affects that many sites when you dig down into it, and we will come on to that. And I think it can easily be resolved through modifications. I don't think there's a fundamental flaw with this. I think it's looking at the application, and as we go through those sites, we will perhaps need to make some modifications rather than to be the issue that other people have mentioned about the whole thing being unsound. I think it's just applying it in the correct way, but having regard to those concerns that are flagged.
Thank you for that, Mr. Nakris. Okay, I'm going to take a lunch break now. It's 12:58. I adjourn the hearing to resume at 1:45. Thank you.